But now let's climb Everest with the magnificent adventurer Tim Macartney-Snape. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Julie.
You're touring Australia in October, telling a remarkable story. It's 30 years since something happened. What was it?
Well, that's the problem when you do something remarkable. It becomes a milestone and, every year you're reminded of it gets further and further away. 30 years, it really doesn't seem like it. But, 30 years ago in October, we became the first Australians to get to the top of Everest.
Not just the top. You did it in very special ways. What were the things that were special?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because it becomes more pertinent now that Everest become, a bit of a tourist spot for alpine climbers. I actually never was interested in climbing Everest when I started out being a mountaineer. I suppose I was a bit of a youthful snob, and I thought Everest was for people who wanted a big note themselves, and anyway, it was out of my league in terms of expense. But when I first set eyes on the mountain, I couldn't help wondering what it was like up there, and you start dreaming about, wouldn't it be great to be the first Australian to climb it, but climb it in good style. That means without a large support team, preferably without oxygen and without a whole string of fixed ropes and camps behind you. But anyway, one thing led to another, and we found ourselves organising such an expedition. And we planned, as far as I could work out, the North Face was the best option to make this possible. It was still a long shot. In fact, Ed Hillary said, I don't think they'll do it because no one's ever climbed a new route on Everest before without using traditional means and especially oxygen. It was a close run thing, but eventually on the 3rd of October in 1984, Greg Mortimer and I found ourselves on the summit. It was actually sunset, so a bit of a scary time to be up there, but it was fine weather. Luckily, obviously, we managed to survive the descent.
I was about to say, everyone says it's coming down that's really hard in any mountain, isn't it? Coming down is a very important time.
Well, as Ed Hillary famously said when asked about Mallory and Irvine, there's something to be said for getting back down alive. Yeah, obviously when you come down, it's usually at the end of a good period of wet weather, and you're obviously very, very tired. And as any child who's climbed a tree will recognise, climbing down actually is trickier because, your eyes up on top of your head, so it's hard to see where to put your feet. And when you're tired, it's easy to make a mistake, especially at altitude, and when you're not using oxygen breathing equipment, it makes it all that more hazardous, I suppose. Because of the cognitive impact of loss of thin air? Exactly. It's the biggest impact on any organ in your brain basically the lack of oxygen really makes your ability to think straight very difficult. Your thoughts become slippery. It's very hard to hold on to a logical train of thought. It's a lovely expression, your thoughts become slippery. Well, it's a bit like you're in that sort of grey zone between, lucid state between sleep and consciousness, and you find your mind wandering. It's like that, but you're awake. And obviously in a place where every footfall, every handhold has to be considered, that makes it a bit more challenging. Tim Macartney-Snape is with us. He's touring Australia in October, talking about 30 years from the summit. And of course you're involved with World Expeditions now. Indeed, you would be guiding people up mountains. What would you say to them if they said, I'm going to go up a side of a killer mountain that hasn't been done before? I won't use the local guides and get them to put steps and ropes, and I won't bring any oxygen. I'd say good for you, but make sure you have as much experience as you possibly can get, because nothing beats experience when it comes to, when the chips are down, because you can't always predict the weather. In fact, the weather's probably the most dangerous and difficult thing on a mountain. And only when you have a lot of experience can you, or are you in a better position to be able to, get yourself through that sort of condition safely. When you're travelling around Australia, you're touring 15th of October to 30th October, Canberra, Sydney, Katoomba, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, Newcastle, Melbourne, Launceston. What will you be talking to people about? Well, I'll certainly go into how I got into climbing, my early expeditions, because, I think my colleagues and I are a pretty good example of how one should get into climbing. We were members of a club, then we climbed with friends, gradually increasing the height of what we climbed and difficulty of what we climbed until eventually we found ourselves considering Everest. So I'll talk about that, but also about the climb itself, of course, and my subsequent experiences. I actually went back to Everest and climbed it from sea level, and then started a business called Sea to Summit, making outdoor equipment based on that sort of story. And I still climb. It's a lifelong addiction, but why stop doing something you love?
Well, you've been to North Pakistan. I think that's connected to climbing.
Oh yeah, I love northern Pakistan. It's quite a different part of the world to the rest of the subcontinent. The people up there are incredibly, they've got something special about them.
What is it?
Well, I think, it's such a harsh environment to be a farmer, because that's what originally they were. And they're Muslims, but they're very moderate. They're the most courteous people I've ever met, and the most hardy. And they're great people to be in the mountains with. So I've employed them as porters to get to base camps of expeditions, and I love going trekking there. The trouble is these days it's hard to convince people to go to Pakistan because of the troubles they're having, but we actually accessed it from China, so I had no trouble in considering it completely safe.
Tell us about a climb in North Pakistan that you would recommend.
Well, first time I went there was to climb a mountain which the account of which got me into mountaineering, a mountain called Gasherbrum 4. That's one of the most challenging high peaks in the world, but even a trek up the Baltoro Glacier to maybe climb a smaller peak and cross one of the passes you can go over it's a once in a lifetime walk, and if you're lucky enough to do the climb, then because they're the most spectacular mountains on earth, there's no doubt about that. They're very vertical and extensive.
Vertical and extensive, that's what you look for in a mountain?
Well, obviously, there's mountains like we have in Australia, which are all rounded and they've got a certain attraction to them, but for as far as big mountains are concerned, the sharper and steeper, the more spectacular.
Can I just ask you, I'm still a bit haunted by your remark when we began our conversation that Ed Hillary basically recommended against what you did 30 years ago, going up Everest without the oxygen, without the normal guides, and up an unusual face. But you're so humble and quietly spoken in your manner. But what does it tell me about someone that they still had a go, even though Ed Hillary said, "Oh, that sounds spooky"?
Well, yeah, Ed, I don't think would have been offended by saying he was old school, and always, climbers are really explorers, and you're always trying to push the boundary and keep alive, of course. And so it was simply a matter of doing that. The next step was to climb the mountain, or climb a new route without oxygen. And I thought it'd be great for a group of people from the world's flattest continent to achieve that.
You're still proud of it, aren't you? You think it was a great thing to do?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And is there a dream to do something that you haven't done, or have you been able to do, from a climbing perspective, all that you wish?
Oh, look, there's always something, a dream to do, but, that's becomes self-limiting after a while if you're not careful. So,
what do you mean?
Well, you can end up killing yourself if you keep pushing the boundaries. But I think it's more important to understand, the deeper reasons why people climb and why people explore. And it's essentially, to be blunt, it's ego satisfaction. And I think, understanding what drives us to be egotistical and is the interesting thing. And it turns out it's not a bad thing. It's actually incredibly heroic.
When you say ego satisfaction, what do you mean? That's very frank, but what do you mean?
Well, we're all variously insecure, and I'm simply using the ideas of a friend of mine who's a biologist who's explains human nature from a fundamental biological point of view. But we're all variously insecure because of the problem of the human condition, the battle between instinct and intellect, and so we find ourselves in a situation where we need affirmation from the world around us, and ego is one way of doing that, saying I'm fundamentally good. We all, truly believe this underneath, but it's a very difficult thing to prove in the world as it is. So, we find ourselves having to go out and prove ourselves, and mountaineering's probably an extreme way of doing this, but business people are the same, athletes are the same.
I feel that anyone, Tim Macartney-Snape, who can get to your tour 30 years from the summit, running from the 15th of October to the 30th of October in cities and towns across the country, are very lucky. You are an interesting man, and thank you for coming on the program.
Well, thanks for having me.